Today I want to talk a little bit about the Tier 8 tech tree British heavy cruiser HMS Drake. And I'll say right off the bat, I think this is a pretty good ship, although I believe people out there will disagree with that assessment because people have weird opinions about heavy cruisers with quote-unquote low DPM, and the Drake certainly fits that bill. But I'll try to make the case to you why I think it's a good ship and worth pursuing. Before we really get there, though, we'll run down the stats as we usually do on these first look at ships. The Drake has 46,800 hit points, which I think is just fine for a Tier 8 cruiser. It seems perfectly robust. The torpedo damage reduction, though, I noticed seemed a little bit high. I might be wrong about this, but I don't think most cruisers at any tier have torpedo damage reductions over 20%. The Drake has 22% torpedo damage reduction, and I think that's probably pretty good. But once we get to the guns, that's where we get into the area where the ship really sort of shines, and also the area that I think people are going to find somewhat problematic. To begin with, there are 9 guns. They're set in 3 triple turrets, 2 on the front, 1 on the back. They have a range of 17.2 kilometers with my build, and keep in mind I'm using the standard British cruiser commander Bruce Fraser. He's the one with more of the offensive-minded skills, and with him, the range is 17.2 kilometers. It's a little bit lower than that at base. The reload time is the place where I think most people are going to have a contention with this ship. I've got the reload down to 16.2 kilometers, and I'm using the Epic Reload mod on the thing, I think, actually. Or did I say 16.2 kilometers? 16.2 seconds is the reload. That is pretty long, I'll grant you, and it does mean the DPM, at least on paper, is fairly low. But the turrets turn in 21.2 seconds for 180 degrees, which is not fast, but it's also not painfully slow. The real part of this gun stats, where the ship shines, is in the HE and AP maximum damage. The Drake boasts a maximum HE shell damage of 3,850, which is nearly 4,000. That is a big number for a cruiser. Most cruisers' maximum HE shell damage is 2,000, maybe 3,000 if you're lucky. The Drake is 3,850, and it boasts a 24% fire chance. Now, according to the website www.wowsbuilds.com, go there today. It is a website created by a community contributor named Father Mundy. According to that website, the Drake has an HE DPM of 189k. I compared that to some other cruisers at the tier. For example, the Buffalo has a HE DPM of about 210. So the Drake's HE DPM is unimpressive on paper. It's fairly low, but you have to keep some things in mind. The effectiveness or efficacy of a cruiser is not going to be primarily determined by how fast do its guns reload. There's a difference between having cracked out DPM and having enough or being effective at dealing damage. The Drake is effective at dealing damage in spite of the fact that it doesn't have cracked out DPM like, for example, the Neptune, the Tier 8 tech tree British light cruiser would have. It doesn't have the same numbers with its HE or AP DPM, but what it does have is the ability, when it lands its HE shells, to penetrate way more than 32 millimeters of armor and do a massive ton of damage. Once we start shooting at this Yamato or this GK out here, that should become clear to you. There's a couple salvos in this game. I don't know if it'll be this one or one coming up later, where we land a number of shells on this Yamato and we do 7k. There you go, 7,600 damage with 6 shell penetrations on that slot, and it lights a fire to boot. This is not low damage by any means at all. This is like the miniature cheap version of a Conqueror. The pen on this HE is so good, the alpha strike is so high, and the fire chance is so high, that you just end up melting battleships. You got to play this thing at distance, of course, and you don't really want to get shot in it. It doesn't have the best armor. The bow and the stern are 25 millimeters, so they can be overmatched by everything. The upper armor belt on the side is 27, so it can be overmatched by most things, but the deck armor and the citadel plating are both enough to bounce battleship caliber shells. And the Drake has a highly improved repair party, which you might have just seen in action there. It can restore quite a lot of HP unless you take, a bunch of permanent damage like citadels, but fire damage, for example, HE penetration, even AP penetration, this heal can return a lot of it. And so long as you keep yourself angled like you would in any cruiser, try to make yourself an unattractive target and difficult to hit, battleships are going to have a fairly difficult time hitting you, and some of them are simply going to bounce your shells off off parts of your armor scheme. So the cruiser is fairly tanky and pretty survivable with its HP pool, its armor, and its heal. The AP is likewise pretty good. I believe it's the short fuse British AP, so that can be useful against the broadsides of enemy cruisers. But the shells do a maximum of 6,210 damage, which is quite high. That's like 12k if you hit 2 citadels, and these shells can strike the citadels on enemy cruisers. The real downside of these shells is that they're British, which means they're exceptionally floaty. They're almost American level floaty, but I think the British might actually be slower. You can see they take a long time to reach the target. But when they do, and when you're firing the HE, they do deal a lot of damage, and they start a lot of fires. We're up to 6 fires in this game, and 84,000 damage done. The Drake also has torpedoes, but they're not blowing anything out of the water, so to speak, unless they make contact with an enemy ship. There are only 8 of them, 2 quad launchers on either side of the ship. They have a pretty snappy reload at 96 seconds, and since this is a British vessel, you can, of course, single fire them in a straight line. They do a maximum damage of 16,767, which is fairly middle of the road. It's fine. They'll hit hard if they land on something. And they're fairly inconspicuous, too. They've got a sea detectability range of 1.3 kilometers, a range of 11 km, and a fairly middling to slow speed of 62 knots. They're not the main armament on this ship. They're a supplemental armament, and it's nice when they hit. But here's another example of the Drake's guns being, as the kids say today, absolutely fire. They do 3k to that Z46 with a couple shell hits, and so long as we dial in our aim correctly and account for his turn and don't rely exclusively on the auto aim and can hit him consistently, well, there's another 4k. I mean, this HE can be devastating. It just doesn't reload very quickly. But you can see we've procced the Epic Reload mod twice, so we've got this down to a fairly respectable 15 seconds. I think that's comparable to something, for example, like the Atago, which has a very slow reload, but also very hard-hitting HE, and I don't think people often accuse that ship of not being good. But people do say that about the poor Drake, and I don't get it. The AA defense on the thing is, I don't know, nothing special. It's got an overall AA defense rating of 78, and the maximum range on its AA guns is 5 kilometers, but those 5-kilometer AA guns only do 89 DPS, which is absolutely nothing. The mid-range at 3.5 km do 117, which is also not impressive. I wish you could see the flak in the stats page so you had an idea of how much flak this thing was putting out, but I don't think the AA is winning any awards. The maneuverability is fine. It's got a maximum speed with my commander build of 34.1 knots, which is perfectly adequate. Turning circle radius is 760 meters, which, I mean, not too big, but not too small. And the rudder shift is 8.8 seconds, and that's perfectly manageable. But like a lot of the other British cruisers, the concealment is also a highlight. With the concealment module and Mikawa as one inspiration, we've got our detectability down to 10 kilometers by sea, which is Very nice. Pretty stealthy for a cruiser. Not as stealthy as some things like the Brindisi, for example, which can get down closer to 9 kilometers, but 10 kilometers is still fairly impressive. So I think these things all add up together to make a cruiser that is very effective at dealing damage at long to medium range with its extremely effective HE. Honestly, the Alpha Strike is huge, the fire chance is great, this HE just pens everything and melts things. You just need time, because the DPM on paper is pretty low, and the reload is pretty slow. So you need to survive the whole game, and you need to be shooting HE at large targets like battleships, AP at broadside cruisers, you will wreck those, and of course the HE against destroyers. The real downside to this ship, I think, is that it follows the Albemarle at Tier 7. And also, people think the Albemarle is bad, but they're wrong about that. The Albemarle is fine. The thing about that ship, though, is that it gets the radar consumable. For some reason, the Drake, even though it is the successor to the Albemarle on the tech tree, is not allowed to have radar. It's got an improved heel, it's got sonar with a long duration, and it's got a fighter plane consumable, but no radar. Why? I have no idea. It makes no sense. You would think the successor to a Tier 7 cruiser on the tech tree that has radar would also have radar. But I think the answer Wargaming gave was, spreadsheet says Drake is doing just fine and having good battle impact, so it doesn't need radar, and if it did have radar, it would be too powerful. I am very skeptical of that argument. I think the Drake can and should have radar, because it doesn't really make any sense that it doesn't, being the successor to a cruiser that does. By the way, here you can see the heel in action. The Conqueror did hit us very hard with his AP. It overmatched our 27mm plating and nearly took us out. But we're able to heal back like 3.5 bars of health. That's about, 15, almost 20,000 hit points. So this really is a super British heal. Offers it quite a bit of tankiness. And the game is basically over here. You can see we've done 141,000 damage. Which, these aren't numbers that are blowing anybody out of the water by any means. There are cruisers, of course, that have and will continue to do way more damage than this. But I think this is a good game for proof of concept. There are people out there who are going to tell you the Drake sucks because it doesn't have cracked out HE DPM like some of the light cruisers at Tier 8 or Tier 7 or Legendary Tier or whatever, but no, you don't need cracked out DPM. You just need good guns with great HE pen and great HE fire chance. And the Drake's got that, plus some other benefits to boot. I think it's a good ship and well worth grinding. Hope you enjoyed this video. If so, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.